All right, folks. Chapter 10 is going to look at victims of serial murders. Now, we've seen some of this information in our prior chapters where they've talked about what type of victim selection different types of offenders have engaged in. But in this chapter, we're going to focus solely on victims. So, victimology is the study of victimization, and it helps us understand what sort of things might place people at higher risk for victimization. It helps us understand the victim side of that victim offender relationship, how vulnerable different victims are, and can often tell us a little bit about social dynamics of criminal behavior. Now, the FBI estimates that at any given time in the US, there's about 35 serial killers currently operating. That's not 35 new killers per year, it's 35 at any given time. Now, female offenders often reported operating for longer periods of time than their male counterparts. Now, annually, there's about 30 to 40,000 people who go missing in the US, okay? Those are the documented missing people, people who've been reported to the police as missing. There's other people who also go missing. We'll talk about them a little bit later on, the missing. And those are people who are never actually reported as missing. And so many of them could be victims of serial killers. They could be some of those high risk, easy facilitation victims that we've talked about in prior chapters. Now, we know that serial murder has been in decline, as has homicide in general. And the 2004 study done by our author shows that nearly 80% of cases occurred since 1975. Okay, so between 1975 and 1995, we see this sharp increase, especially compared to the prior 175 years. But between 1995 and 2004, there's been a sharp decline. Now, the face of serial victimization is changing gradually. So, who are our victims? Today, there are fewer numbers of victims per offender. We don't tend to see these offenders with very high kill rates, fewer cases of only female victims, an increase in men being targeted, fewer strangers and more family members being targeted, fewer cases of prostitutes being singled out, fewer cases that involve more than one state, more cases involving shooting as the sole method, and fewer cases of strangulation and suffocation. So let's look at Hickey's more recent data, the 2004 to 2014 study. This is about 270 offenders. And in here, the average number of victims per offender is around 4, okay, 3.7 to 4.6. Only 26% of those offenders killed men only, and 36% killed women only. And as far as adult victims go, overwhelmingly, they were killing adult victims. As far as child victims only, that's only about 7% of offenders. One or more family members being killed is about 12%. And again, strangers are still our most common victim with 81%. Now, in terms of the method of killing, right, we still have this combination of strangling, beating, stabbing, poisoning, and shooting. That's pretty high. That's about a quarter of victims. But in this more recent, this 10-year period here, shooting only is the most common method, and that's 38% of our victims. Now, in terms of these offenders, right, 35% killed their victims within the same year, close to 30% within a 1 to 4 year period. And then we can see that we have very few that are killing over a long period of time. The average span of killing per offender is about 7 years. Now, murder represents less than 1% of all violent crime. In fact, we have twice as many suicides as we do homicides, and we run a much greater risk of being a victim of a domestic homicide as opposed to being a victim of a serial homicide. Here we can kind of see this breakdown. First one over that first entire period that Hickey studied, 1800 to 2004. And then we can see a breakdown every 25 years as to how many cases there were in that particular 25-year period, how many victims, etc. And we can see that we can see a pretty quick increase. Now, remember, some of this is going to be due to that change in that FBI definition from 3 murders to 2. Now, serial murders usually have distinct victim selection criteria, right? They have a particular preferred MO, a method of operation, signature, sexual interest, and they have their own motivations. Now, many people, what makes them a victim has more to do with their routine activities. So, where do they spend their time? Where do they work? What's their socioeconomic status, their education? Where do they live? Um, and those patterns of our own routine activities place us at varying different degrees of risk for becoming a victim of any crime, but certainly of serial crimes, of serial killers as well. So women have begun to be targeted more. We see generally strangers, and we see that with serial killers, right? We see a sexual motivation. Now, we certainly see outliers, right? We do have offenders that kill a lot of people. But again, on average, we're seeing around 3 or 4 victims per offender. Now, states that have larger populations in bigger metropolitan areas where it's more densely populated are more likely to see serial killers because it's going to be easier to blend in, more strangers. So it doesn't have to do with the region of the country someone lives in, but more about how densely populated a particular area is. Now, recall that Hickey has talked about how mobile serial killers are. There are some that travel, right, throughout the United States. Um, that's about 34 to 39% of our victims were victims of serial killers who travel. Another 38 to 44% are victims of local killers, and then 20 to 24% of place specific. So people who murder within their homes, places of employment, or institutions. So, like healthcare workers. Okay, and here we can see a more specific breakdown. Now, one thing we need to focus on a little bit more is these victim offender relationships in serial killing research. One factor that influences victim selection is how much power and control the offender is able to exert, right? So, serial killers are not seeking out people that are physically or intellectually capable as they are, right? This is true generally of most people who are committing violent crime or any type of crime, right? We're usually choosing to victimize somebody that we think we can overtake. So young women, especially when alone, and children can be ideal targets. In recent years, this number of hospital patients and those in residential care become prey to sexual predators and serial killers has been increasing, right? And we talked about this in the chapter on healthcare killers, chapter 6. Now let's focus for a little bit here on missing and murdered children. Okay, so these statistics are obviously about 10 years out of date, right? But the DOJ estimates that every year there's almost 800,000 children in 2011 went missing, okay, or reported missing. So that's a little over 2,000 children every day. But these are not all kids that are kidnapped by your stereotypical stranger on the street. Okay, so about 200,000 are kidnapped by their parents. Okay, so these are generally parents that don't have custody, and another 58,000 were victims of non-family abductions. So of this 800,000, about 100, a little over 100 are victims of this stereotypical kidnapping where the person doesn't know the child, they hold them overnight, they move them, they kill them or demand a ransom or intend to keep the child permanently. So in terms of missing children, we have different categories of missing children. So some kids that are missing are runaways, okay? They've run away from home. And so, yes, technically they're missing, but they haven't been abducted by anybody. As I mentioned before, some are abducted by the non-custodial parent or the parent who doesn't have guardianship. Some might also be abducted by a relative, an aunt, an uncle, or someone else. There's also what's called discarded children. I haven't heard this term used. They're usually referred to as throwaways. These are kids who've been forced to leave their home, kicked out of their home, rejected by their parents. Disposable children are children murdered by their parents, right? So, recording this lecture in January of 2022, there's been a case in New Hampshire, right, where a little girl they just found out has been missing for 2 years. Okay. Stranger abductions, there's abbreviated abductions. Children are abducted for a short period of time and then released. They might never actually make it into any kind of records because by the time someone would go to make that record, the child has been recovered. And then aborted abduction. So children who manage to escape. Every now and then we see a story like this on the news. So in terms of male children, the percentages of male children murdered in the US in all age categories, with the exception of those aged 15 to 19, are similar to female children, right? So boys and girls at similar rates. About 75% of child abduction murder victims are killed within 2 to 3 hours of being abducted. This is why we do issue Amber Alerts when there's sufficient information to issue one. And why we don't wait as long for a child to be missing before the police get involved as we do for an adult to be missing. Right. So usually as an adult, you need to be missing for 48 hours because as an adult, you have a right to go away. You don't have to tell people where you're going. Now, about 20% of all girls and 10% of all boys in the US will be sexually victimized before they become adults. So prior to the age of 18. We know that for male serial killers, right, their primary motivation is sexual. But for female serial killers, they're much more likely to kill children for financial reasons. Now, some of these offenders have become very adept, okay, at luring children, getting children to talk to strangers, even though they've been taught not to talk to strangers. So, in a sample of 420 known serial killers in the US, 24% had killed at least one child. Mostly these were boys, with about a quarter of them being girls, and very few were black. That's because we know, right, that most crime is intraracial, right? So if most of the offenders are white, most of your victims are going to be white. Female killers were more likely to murder relatives, whereas male killers were 7 times more likely to kill a stranger. But female killers were also more likely to use poisons, whereas men were more likely to mutilate, strangle, shoot, or bludgeon their victims. Now, children are less likely to be targeted by a serial killer than to become a victim of a domestic homicide. 21% of all offenders said that they did derive enjoyment from killing the child, and most serial killers who target children are psychopaths. And so here we can see that breakdown of reported motives for killing children. Now, in 1977, they did this Operation Police Lure in Michigan. They wanted to get some better information, some better data about how often children were um, abducted and molested. So they surveyed students in elementary and junior highs in grades 4 through 9. And those kids reported 782 incidents of attempted or actual molestation that had never been reported to authorities. Now, the most commonly targeted age is children 10 to 12. There was no difference between boys and girls being approached, and most often from 3 to 6 p.m. Now, if you think about it, that just kind of makes sense, right? That middle school kids have a lot more freedom after school, and 3 to 6 is kind of that time period where kids are out and about before parents are home from work. Offenders were usually in their 20s or 30s, and they often asked for, they had ruses like, I need help finding my lost puppy. Offenders may use a badge or a blue vehicle so that they appear more like an authority figure, and we have often taught children to comply with authority figures. Now, we talked about this a little bit with the victim choice here, right? But routine activities really focuses on what our day-to-day routine activities are. How do you generally spend your days, right? You guys probably have some routines of specific things you do on a regular basis, right? Now, that can influence opportunities for offenders. Life course theory looks at something a little bit different. It looks at how our offending is influenced by our structural position. So our ability, not our ability, sorry, an offender's ability to recruit victims is going to vary over their life course. Now, we have quite a few agencies that deal with missing, murdered, and exploited children. Probably the most well-known one is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And they have a recovery rate of 97%. So they're pretty successful at getting information out, and recovering missing children. Since 1996, we've had the Amber Alert. Okay. And that has, as of 10 years ago, recovered over 700 children. Dozens of kids are recovered each year. The key thing with the Amber Alert, though, is that you guys have probably seen an Amber Alert go out either on your phone, or you might have seen it on like electronic signs on the highway. Uh, you have to have certain information in order to issue an Amber Alert. Generally, we're looking for like make and model of a car and a license plate, description of the offender, and a description of the missing child. Now, that National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a hotline, and they've handled over more than 4 million calls. And as of 2014, the cyber tip line has received more than 2.4 million reports. Now, in terms of other categories of victimization, in terms of women, we know, right, that the primary motive for serial murder, we often hear this traditional sexual motivation hypothesis, right? And this is often closely tied to sexual assault. So Quinnett examined prostitute victimization between 1970 and 2009, and she noted that prostitutes were a third of all victims of serial homicide. Now, since 2004, that number has dropped to about a fifth, 21% of all victims of serial murder in the US. She also talks about the missing, which is we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. These are people who are never reported as missing, and some could very easily be victims of serial murder. So there could be more prostitutes that are victims of serial murder. So, for instance, the Long Island murders of prostitutes were accidentally discovered, suggesting that there's other victims of serial killers may yet await discovery. Um, Other times, people have focused on research about gay men as victims. There's this idea that somehow, a serial killing of a gay man is more bizarre, but serial murder by in and of itself is bizarre. Okay. Um, Murders committed by Dahmer, Gacy, etc., are equally rivaled by those where the offender was heterosexual.